we've been planning for 2 workshops for you, and we're starting with today's workshop focusing on acing interviews with leadership communication skills. We're going to touch on storytelling, but we're going to go much more in depth about storytelling in our next workshop that is coming up in May. And today is all around acing interviews, really showcasing your communication style as a leader. There's a backstory that I want to share with you, which can actually be a lot more enlightening, and it will provide a lot more context in the content that I'm about to present to you today. And that is, I've started my coaching business about a year ago. And in the past year or so, I've coached over 70 product managers, helping them ace their interviews in this market. And the interesting thing is, before I became a coach in a formal setting, I've been an experienced interviewer. When I was working at Meta, I've interviewed over 200 candidates, both ICs and people managers. And I've also been part of hiring committee discussions. If you had asked me to put this workshop together a year ago, the content would actually be very different from what you're about to see today. And that's because as a coach, I now have conversations with people for a living. I cannot coach you if I don't have a conversation with you. And I do that for a living now. And it might sound very trivial on the surface, which is all around having conversations. But if you actually take a minute to actually think about what are conversations, you will start to realize the connection between having a good conversation and acing your interview. It's very, very similar. And at the end of the day, acing an interview is really just about having a good conversation. And there's really just 2 types of conversations. The type that makes you want to have more conversations down the line, and the type that doesn't make you want to have more conversations down the line. It's actually very similar to having a good first date. The kind of first date that makes you want more versus the kind that makes you want to stop. So that's really the context that I really did not realize just by being an interviewer. And it's something that I just recently realized that I'm now able to articulate a lot better as a coach. So if you were to ask me today, what makes a candidate stand out? I actually want you to take a minute and let me know in the chat what you think a standout candidate looks like in an interview setting. And I want you to think about the backstory that I just shared. Something about having a good conversation. Present and engaging, yes. Confident, yes. Being memorable, inspiring, crisp storytelling, building a connection. Resonates with you, yes. And if you were to ask me to host this workshop a year ago when I was an experienced interviewer, but not a coach, I would probably just tell you tools that you could use to organize your thoughts. I would give you frameworks that you could use to make your storytelling a little bit more crisp. But today, I actually have a different framing for you. And that is basically leveraging the lessons I've learned now that I have coaching conversations with people for a living. And the word that I would pick to answer this question, if I could only pick one word, it would be the word charisma. Because I feel like the word charisma fully and encompasses the spirit of what we're trying to do here, which is just having a very good conversation. And I'm going to ask you to go on mute because the feedback will make me want to pause because I'm going to think it's a question. But okay, thank you so much. Now, charisma is what helps you stand out, what helps you have good conversations. And that's because if you actually look at what charisma means in an interview setting, it really just breaks down into two dimensions. The first one is having a great first impression, and that makes complete sense, right? It's an interview at the end of the day. It's about establishing a great first impression.
Dễ trơn. Má mình trơn.
Second, oh, sorry, Nancy. I'll try to figure out who that is and mute them.
No worries. Okay, second dimension to being charismatic in an interview setting is highlighting your leadership qualities. And this part is important because product managers are leaders, and product management role is a leadership role regardless of what your level might be. And so to be charismatic in an interview is about showcasing your leadership qualities and having that great first impression. And my goal for you today is to give you tactical tools that you could use to apply in your interview prep. When I look at charisma and I look at first impression and I look at the word leadership, they all feel like fluffy words that mean different things. But if you actually just think about what first impression is, it's about what you say and also how you say it. It's very similar to what leadership is how you lead teams and how you present yourself. And so there's an element of what you say, and then there's a different element, which is how you say it, how you present yourself. So I came up with this 3-part framework that helps you up your charisma level in an interview setting such that you could showcase your leadership qualities to improve and establish a great first impression from the get-go. And my goal is to give you tools across this 3-part framework. And this is the framework. Number 1 is your competence. Number 2, your character. And number 3, your connection. So what is competence? Competence is you proving that you have the experience to do the job. Competence is what you have done in the past. And I would say most of the candidates spend most of their time proving that they're competent. But that's not enough to having a great conversation. Just because you're competent and just because that you could prove that you're competent does not mean that this conversation is going to be so good that you want to have more and more conversations down the line. That is the difference between a candidate that might check all the check boxes, but might not get to the next round and might not get a job offer at the end of the day. Second part of this 3-part framework is character. Character is who you are as a PM, who you are as a leader, and who you are as a person. Competency is what you have done. Character is who you are. These are actually very different things. And yet, most of the candidates spend most of their time, if not all the time, just preparing to prove that they're competent. Now, character is because this is who you are, it doesn't change from company to company. It doesn't change from team to team, right? This is something that you take with you no matter which job you have, but competency is slightly different. Just because you have a list of competent skills might not mean that you need all of them in this particular role or in this particular job. And it's basically just a variety of different tools that you have in your toolbox that helps you get the job done. But who you are is different. This is just how you work, how you act, how you be. Okay, the third part of this framework is connection. And that's the emotional connection that we want to establish in an interview setting. And 3 of these dimensions put together would give you that charisma level that actually helps you stand out in an interview, that helps you have a good conversation such that you want to have more conversations down the line. And in this workshop, I'm going to give you tactical tools that you could use for each of these 3 areas in this framework, starting with the first one, competency. And this is where you want to leverage storytelling techniques to help you tell your stories. And again, most of the candidates spend most of their time, if not all their time, preparing their stories. So I want to take a second here and ask you to think about percentage of time that you use in your interview prep in bucket number 1 versus 2 versus 3. How much time do you allocate in your interview prep? Would you say 33, 33, 33%? What would it be? Let me know in the chat. Julie and Jeff, I hear you. Yes. Mike, I'll be really interested in the 40% of time you put into forming that emotional connection. We're going to talk about that in a bit. Math is hard, I agree. Yes. For me, it was probably 90% in the competency dimension. So let's talk about competency. This is where most of the candidates use the STAR framework to help them come up with their stories and to tell their stories. I actually have a different recommendation for you, and that's called the BLUFF framework, bottom line up front, otherwise known as T-shape communication. I highly recommend the BLUFF framework over STAR. And that's because to communicate like a leader, you have to sound like one. Leaders communicate at a high level and they don't go deep unless they need to. So we take a minute to think about the leaders that you know, the leaders that you work for, the leaders that you work with. How do they communicate? And we say this all the time about our leaders. Oh, they're very high level. They don't really know the details, right? That's how leaders communicate. That's T-shaped communication, otherwise known as BLUFF. It's a leadership communication style. Now, take a minute and think about the shape for the STAR framework. If you had to assign it a shape, what would it be? What is STAR? Starting with situation. So you're going right away deep into the weeds. And task, you might come back up to talk about tasks. And then you go deep again to talk about actions that you have taken. And then you'll come back up to talk about the results. That's W-shaped communication. Sometimes it could look like a V. You go deep into the weeds, talk about the situation, you'll stay down there, and then you come back to talk about the results. So it could be V-shape. Now, the risk in using a STAR framework, it actually could get us deep in the weeds for a long time, hence a U-shaped communication. We go down to talk about the situation and then we rat hole and we stay down there for a long time and then we get back again at the end where we're talking about results. U-shape or V-shape or W-shape communication actually makes it hard to follow for the person who doesn't really have a lot of context, unless you are an amazing storyteller, super vivid with great imagery. Chances are we're not that great at storytelling. And so think about the perspective of your interviewer. They're probably talking to multiple candidates a day. And they're also probably working on a lot of high priority projects that day. And this interview is probably not the highlight of their day. So it's probably just something that they're doing in between their meetings. And so they're probably not listening to your stories as intently as you think they are. And that's just, I think, a fair assumption that we could have when we go into these interviews. So the risk in using STAR, whether it's V shape or W shape or U shape, is that we could lose their attention really easily. Now, the opposite of STAR is the T-shaped communication, where you're talking about your bottom line and you're giving it upfront before you go deep. And if your bottom line is so unique and so compelling and so intriguing, you would hook them into your story. And once you have their attention, now you could go deep and they will listen. That is the beauty of delivering the bottom line up front that really tells them your unique perspective And then once they have your attention, you could go deep. Now you could have all kinds of wiggly lines in the lower part of the T if you want to, because now you have their attention. That is the difference between the STAR framework and the BLUFF framework. And in the second part of this workshop, I'll make sure that we have time. We'll go over some of these examples together, and I'll help you construct your BLUFFs to demonstrate the difference between a STAR framework and leveraging BLUFF to tell your stories, to highlight your competency level. We're leveraging the T-shaped communication here in this workshop. I'm going to give you the high-level things in the beginning, and in the second half, we'll go deep. That's T-shape. So back to our three-part framework. Second part of this three-part framework is character. And the best question to leverage to really showcase your character is, tell me about yourself. Now, most candidates also talk about what they have done when they're asked, tell me about yourself. But if you think about the context and the bigger picture in which this question is asked, it's typically the first question that you're asked in an interview setting. The first 1 minute or 2 minutes, they'll say, oh, tell me about yourself. But you actually have the entire meeting, 30 minutes or 45 minutes or 1 hour to talk about your competency, to talk about what you have done. This is actually the golden window in which you can actually talk about yourself, as in who you are as a person. And this is where that opportunity is it's actually very strategic if you think about it. So you've probably heard the crazy number out there that the result of the interview is actually determined in the first 7 minutes of the interview or something like that, right? That is where you want to form that initial emotional connection with that interviewer on the other side, who at the end of the day is just a human being. You just want to have a good conversation with that person. And a framework that I like to use to highlight my character when they ask me, tell me about yourself, is definitely not, here's my degree, this is my title, this is a company I worked at, here's my most amazing project that I have led. I could save that later, right? In the first golden minute of this conversation, I want to tell you more about who I am. And for that, I actually like to lead with my purpose. And since we're product managers and leaders in this room, I'm going to hypothesize that your purpose is probably along the lines of having the passion to create something that makes things better for other people, since we're all product people here. And so I would lead with something like that, with your passion to improve the lives of others. And a framework that I like is probably introducing a positive influencer in my life who created this core value in my belief system. So, for example, I was raised by my grandmother who always says X, Y, and Z. And so I've always gravitated toward jobs that help me do that thing that my grandma always said to pay attention to. Right? That's how you can make a natural connection between a positive influencer to something that you really, really believe in. This is just who you are as a person. And here are the phrases that I like to use. I've always been passionate in, I've always been inspired by, I've always looked for roles that did X, Y, and Z. And my dream, because of this core value, because of this positive influencer, I want to help people like my grandmother, etc. My dream is to do X, Y, and Z. And this creates that emotional connection right from the get-go. And then you can use the rest of the interview to prove that you're competent. And another question that you could really leverage to showcase who you are would be toughest feedback that you have ever received, or low light in your career, or a project that failed. And this is where you could really talk about your growth areas, your development. This is where you could be very vulnerable and be real. And when we're vulnerable, it's more likely that we establish that connection that we want from just one human being to another human being. So you could talk about your defining moments, challenges, and setbacks. So I want to give you an example of how I like to answer this question. If you were to ask me, tell me about the low light in your career. I would actually use the BLUFF framework here. My bottom line up front is my low light is actually the highlight of my career, even though it was so difficult for me in that moment, but it actually turned out to be the highlight of my entire career. That is an example of BLUFF. That's my bottom line up front. And it's my unique perspective. Only I have this perspective. No one else does. And if I were to throw out an opening statement that is intriguing, that is unique, it's more likely that you're going to lean into my stories. And it's more likely that you want to find out more. Oh, what do you mean your low light is actually your highlight? Tell me more, right? That is an example of leveraging BLUFF and looking for ways to really highlight who you are as a person. So coming back to our 3-part framework, the third part of this framework is connection. And there are things and techniques and tools I can share with you that helps you establish that emotional connection in an interview setting. And I actually want to hear from Mike later when we're actually workshopping on the 40% of the time that you spend toward having that emotional connection in an interview setting. So I'm doing very well on time here. Let's dive deeper. And this is now going into an interactive portion of this workshop. We're going to workshop together. And the FAQ, most frequently asked questions that I get of all time is, what's a BLUFF? What BLUFF can I use? So let's workshop together and let's help you form your BLUFFs that you could use in these situational interviews. So starting with the example that I used just now, a low point in your career. My BLUFF is the low point, the low light is actually my highlight. That's the top of the T. And now that you're leaning in, I'm going to go deeper now. So a low light of my career was when I got laid off from my dream job. It was such a dream for me when I was working at Roku. I loved the people. I loved my project. And I also loved the balance. It was not a high stress job. And I really loved that the role forced me to think about how the Roku users form that emotional connection with the Roku brand. That in itself it forced me to think about the quality of the product more so than driving engagement. That was what I was focusing on when I was at Meta. It was all about driving engagement, but Roku really cared about brand loyalty. Roku really cared about how their users use their product and the feelings that they would get. And so because that product and that role was really perfect for me when I got laid off, it was definitely the low point in my almost 20-year career. But what happened after the layoff was this chance to venture into something new, creating my own online business, creating a business that is centered around creating that emotional connection with other people, such that I can actually uplift a lot more people on a personal level compared to leveraging technology to uplift others. If we could use the word uplift in a technology app sense, I think that's actually kind of a stretch, but because of this low light, it actually gave me the opportunity to create something that is very, very meaningful for me. Hence, the low light of my career is actually the highlight of my career. And I could go deeper now if there's appetite, right? So that demonstrates how we can leverage BLUFF in an interview setting such that it is a lot more unique compared to just using a STAR framework. So I would love to work with a volunteer for this particular question, and I can help you workshop what your BLUFF might be. Do I have a volunteer?
Whenever there's silence, I feel compelled to raise my hand. So if no one else raises their hand, I'm in, but I'm the backup.
We have Julie with her hand up, and Mike, and then the other one is Curtis. So we got three folks. So Julie did the diplomatic hand raise in Slack and Zoom. So we'll go with Julie first.
And Julie has her final round with Amazon next week. So this is timely.
Hi, Julie.
Oh no.
I can't hear.
Julie, you're coming through quite robotically right now. I'm not sure if you have an audio issue.
So I can read one of her questions from the chat. The chat's working, Julie. So you type, I'll be your words. And so she asked in the chat, Amazon emphasizes STAR framework. Do you think they're okay with using BLUFF? A disclosure, I have a final round next week. So I think there's a good chance you do coach Amazon candidates, Nancy. So maybe you have some advice for folks going through the loop in that process.
Well, I think we should actually, let's first understand why they recommend STAR. It gives you a structure for your stories. It's not the only structure that you can use for your stories. It's just the most popular one. And as long as you're structured and you don't stay really deep in the rabbit hole, I believe that you could use any framework. And the beauty with BLUFF is that you could start with your bottom line up front and then do the STAR. So it does not compete and conflict with the STAR framework.
So it seems like Julie's audio is still muted or still having issues. So if we have another volunteer, we can hopefully come back to Julie in a little bit. Who was second in line?
Curtis, can you unmute your mic and talk? Let's see if we got.
Yeah, for sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Happy days. The low point of my career, something I go to when I get interviewed is I talk about how I actually got myself fired from a company because I was looking at all our locations across Canada to baseline the city I was responsible for running and showing that we were well below the metrics they had expected because nobody in the company was looking at this. And like after handing in this report that I did off like kind of the side of my desk, within 2 weeks I was given my like notice to leave because they're like, oh, we're just going to close down this whole operation. So like taking that, knowing that I use that as a leverage point to say like, I'm in this for the work and the work to be good and like separate of my position. Like the typical person would find that information out and not share it with head office, but I leverage that from like an honesty perspective to say like, this might have met my job, but I still handed it in because I thought it was important for people to be aware of.
So let's workshop what BLUFF you might leverage for that. So because you're super honest and you believe in the power of honesty in surfacing information that you believe is valuable for the organization, even though it might potentially hurt you, you still believe that you should do the right thing by the company. So knowing that is who you are in your core, how does that actually help you be better?
For sure. As an employee for the company,
For any company.
for any company, yeah, for sure.
That trait.
Well, I think it's like I'm not interested in like hiding and like maintaining a position on like CPR if it's not like the right fit for the company itself. Like there's that whole thing of like the memes of like keep shareholder value above everything else, right? We're just like we're just slaves. But the matter is like everybody should be enjoying what they're doing and be honest about where things are at. And I think that's beneficial to have someone on the team as like not a policeman, but just like a baseline of reality and giving them the information straight without any spin to it. Because I also personally don't like playing politics in the office a lot. Like I just like doing the work and like that's what you can guarantee to get out of me if you hire me for this role.
So in short, how would you shorten that? So a BLUFF, so for example, my BLUFF is my low light is actually my highlight. So that took a split second.
Right.
How would you shorten it?
I'm so honest, I got myself fired. Like that's kind of like the tagline.
Okay.
And like that causes enough interest to kind of like go down the rest of the rabbit hole. That's how I would like tighten that up.
There you go. So the point of the bluff is you want to use it as a hook to hook them in, and now you have more room and more space to tell your story. So in this bluff, I am so honest, I got myself fired. So this definitely draws the attention. But there's a but. How might you spin it in a positive light so that it's not completely terrible?
I think like maybe on the back end you could say like I saved the company like 40,000, like insert dollar figure here because
There you
they're
go.
able to close down their like Vancouver satellite office as a result of my honesty. So it wasn't like negligence on my part. It was like actually organizational change, which I know we get a lot when we get fired.
Yes. And also closing down something
Mm.
in itself is impact. Because when you turn off something, you could turn on something better. So shutting down a business line, a business unit in itself is impact. And you helped that organization drive impact through your honesty. So there you go. You can use that as your bluff.
Well, thank you. That's really helpful.
Sure. Do I have another volunteer for this particular prompt?
I would actually like to volunteer.
Was that Shika?
Yes, Nancy.
Go ahead, Shika.
Okay. So outcome, I actually don't know, but the situation was somewhere around what we are discussing. So I wasn't fired. Actually, I was replaced without a prior notification. How I got to know about that 3 or 5 day prior system generated email that I'm being released. So that was the whole situation. Now, practically, so how I processed it was I took it, of course, imposter syndrome on myself that maybe I was not enough, but eventually channelized those thoughts and energy in upskilling myself in certain area and then applied for a different role within the same org and then landed into a way better place and different geography. So that was the goal we were trying to achieve in the first role. So there was a geographical movement that was happening where I was replaced. So that's the whole situation.
Got it. So that from your perspective, something bad happened, but then it resulted in something positive.
Yes.
How did this benefit the organization, if any?
Maybe the another product team actually got a better person who could value somebody for getting the way out of getting getting her stuff done irrespective of what the situation was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
So maybe a go-getter kind of so the another product team actually got somebody who's a go-getter attitude. That's on top of my mind.
how would you now shorten that story into something that is, let's say, 3 seconds long?
I'll give it a try. So there was a time in my career when I was replaced without a prior notification from a job role where there was a geography movement involved. Later on, I utilized my skills to upskill myself in different areas and changed my attitude to become a go-getter and get exactly what aligns with my career goals.
Is it appropriate to also use the same bluff that I use, which is the low light is actually the highlight of my career? Would you resonate with that statement or not really?
Yes, but the challenge I'm facing is in this situation, how actually there is an impact on the organization. I don't know. It's more on a personal front. So that's where I'm kind of finding it hard to actually implement. It actually worked for me, but how it going to shift that thought about making an impact at organizational level?
Well, the impact here is you learned firsthand that this type of news, you might receive news that feels very uncomfortable, but based on this experience, you know that what's uncomfortable on the surface level doesn't mean that you have to make it uncomfortable forever.
Mhm.
There is an element to this uncomfortable news that actually motivated you or actually led you down this other path that actually turned out to be really positive. And so it actually helped you exercise this resilient mindset that you wouldn't have exercised before.
Yes.
So for your story, your bluff can be something like the low light of my career is actually what made me really resilient today. Such that when there is hardship, and I know hardships can happen, I know that I could strongly consider myself as someone with a resilient mindset.
Perfect.
Something
So
along those lines.
yeah, so it's not primarily limited to actually have that bluff aligning towards how it could benefit at organization. It could be personal, or it could be how you kind of uh, just like in this example, it could be understanding, okay, you have a resilience in your personality. It
Yes.
could be any.
Yeah. And then you could also tie it back to the organization. When employees are more resilient, organizations will get the most out of their employees.
Okay.
How does that feel?
Feel good. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that workshop. So let's try another question, okay? So the next question is, tell me about a project that you're the most proud of. And we're just talking about your bluff here. Do I have any volunteers for this example prompt?
I can go.
Go for it.
Also, hi.
Hello.
A project I'm most proud of was something that it was a 0 to 1 API project with my company. We were a small team that handled a lot of things, but then we were able to go about, sorry, I'm being weirdly vague for some reason.
You're fine.
we doing customer discovery, we discovered that there was a potential product line that we can go after, and this was the right time to do it. It would have enabled a lot of our enterprise customers to integrate with us seamlessly, much faster, by days even, to get started. So within a 6-week period, my team was able to build an initial beta and get about 10 customers, equaling in about $1 million ARR in just a month, say a month and a half, to sign on. And yeah, I guess that's my proudest moment of 6 weeks being able to prove $1 million of worth to the company.
Would you say that this is a success because of your execution, because of your strategy, because of the people, because of the process?
I think it was my best project because it was a intersection of all of those things. Our team got to the point where we trusted each other enough to do the work we each needed to do to figure out how we could be successful in the 6 weeks. The team got to the point where we were clear enough with how we communicated the needs and the challenges that we were looking at, and even breaking down the problem to the smallest so we could reach it in 6 weeks, so that there wasn't any big surprises throughout the development period. It was so smooth. It let me actually end up working more with the customer side and the revenue side to just find all those customers and find whether or not they would be willing to re-sign just for the promise of testing this out. The low light of this is like it never got to see the light of day, but they were promised things, they re-signed. I got to say that much.
Sure. Okay. So a
Yeah.
bluff that I like to use for this particular prompt is this, which is I've had success for my projects on 3 different levels. It was successful because of the process, or it was successful because of the product itself was amazing, or because it was successful in the people dimension. And if we're just talking about product, then it was possibly successful because the strategy was really awesome, or because the execution was really awesome, or maybe just because of optics. It was claimed really, really successful. In my experience, I've seen success on all these different dimensions. And your example, Nicole, I would say, in my experience, I've seen success on all these different dimensions, but the story that I'm going to tell you is actually one that is successful because of everything that you see here, because of the process, because of the people, because of the product itself, because of the strategy, and because of execution, and because of optics. It was great success. Okay, now we go deep. So the reason why I like to use this particular framework, you could call this the 3 Ps: process, product, people. And then within product, if you want to double click into the product dimension, you could talk about the strategy layer, you could talk about the execution layer, you could talk about optics. Most candidates would pick something in the execution layer, and they only talk about a project that was really hairy to execute, maybe really tight timelines with some kind of complexity. You had to bring all the teams together, but that's only within the execution layer. And that is why this particular bluff can help you sound a lot more senior compared to a lot of candidates out there who only focus on the execution piece. When you say that, in my experience, I've led projects where it was successful on 3 different dimensions, right away you're showing that you have a lot of experience. You have seen success in all kinds of different flavors. And you have seen one that blends all of these together into a hybrid success. And that is what makes you sound a lot more senior, because you're not just focusing on one example of success. And if they want, they could say, okay, tell me about a project that was successful because the process, or because of the people, or because of whatever it was. So you could go really deep when you start with a bluff statement like that. And the reason why I like this bluff is because now you can leverage it on other types of prompts. For example, you could use it to talk about failures. So tell me about a project that failed. Well, in my experience, I have seen a project that failed because of process, because of people, or because the strategy was bad, or because the execution was bad, or maybe it only failed because optics. So again, when we open with a bluff that is really high level, this is how we show our seniority, because we have seen success or failure across all different dimensions. That's the beauty of using bluff compared to star. So you can also use this bluff when you're talking about conflicts. Tell me about a time you had a conflict. Most of the people, again, would just focus on that execution piece. So you want to stand out, you want to up level your communication, you want to 10x your communication. This is a tactic that you could use to up level your communication. So I actually had this question from Duncan earlier. Leading a major initiative, but I left the company before its launch. So again, when we're starting with a bluff that is really high level, you could talk about success because the process was really awesome, because the people is awesome, or within product strategy was awesome, or execution was awesome, or optics was awesome. Launching it is really just an element within the execution. So now that we have zoomed out, just because you left the company before it launched, you're really just missing out on the execution piece, which is just a small element of the whole story that you could tell. So it's really not as daunting as you think it might be, is the point that I'm trying to illustrate in using this BLUFF. Any questions on this?
Do you mind expanding a bit more on what you mean by optics?
Yeah, optics is something that can often happen when you're in a large company. Optics is about who gets the credit. So you might be working on an initiative that is across multiple orgs or different engineering teams, backend or API team or whatever. Some team gets more credit than this other team. That is an example of optics. It's just an internal struggle, an internal PR problem.
And when you leverage it, are you using it as a way to kind of highlight that you got the credit or like your team, or is it more like to come across as humble, or is it both?
Well, part of the PM's job is to drive and represent your team accurately. Part of that is get the credit that your team deserves. But maybe because of politics, maybe because I'm just not super savvy when I'm navigating internally across organizations, I didn't get all the credit for the team that the team really deserves. That is actually a failure on my part as a PM. It has nothing to do with the actual execution. And it has nothing to do with the actual impact that the team drove. But because of optics, another team got more credit and they got promoted, but my team didn't, for example. Okay, let me go on to another prompt. How do you work with a difficult team member? And just really focus on the BLUFF.
Noise canceling headphones.
That's nice and cheeky. I like that. Anything else?
Do we have anyone that wants to jump on this one? Mayor, you put a message in the thread. Would you like to jump in?
Sure. I I come from the experience where I was assigned to a project with another product manager because he had domain experience coming in onto that segment of the product. People are not open on what's happening on their personal side, and understandably so. I realized after several weeks down the line that he was undergoing a divorce, not a pleasant counter effect on the work, right? All I had to do is understand he's a human being. Maybe he's going through something. So sometimes I'll pick up the slack. Sometimes I'll wait for him to reflect and hold his end of the bargain. We were successful. This was prior to immigrating to Canada. In the aftermath, I won a friend for a life.
That's such a beautiful story. My invitation here is really look at what types of conflicts might exist in a workplace. Most people would talk about a bottoms up type of conflict, which is more related to personal struggles on a personal level. So, for example, my dog ate my homework kind of situation. My son got sick or something happened and I'm not able to dedicate my full attention to work. That is a bottoms up reason for someone being difficult. There's a tops down reason for making someone difficult. And that is when you're forced to work with someone and their goals are not aligned with your goals. That has nothing to do with what is happening in your personal life. That's just because you and I have two different goals that conflict with each other, and therefore we're not able to make good progress. An example of a conflicting goal could be maybe the engineering team really wants to stable the platform. And as the PM, I want to drive top line results. That is a conflicting thing. I could say the engineering manager is being very difficult, but it's not because of their personal stories, right? It's just because our goals are different. That is one example of a tops down reason that makes someone quote unquote difficult to work with. So the reason, the resolution to addressing conflict or addressing difficulty would be very different if the reason for the difficulty is a personal reason versus a organizational reason. And so the bluff that you could use here is based on my experience, I've had difficulties with people for two different reasons. One is they're difficult because of a tops down organizational situation. And two is because they're having a difficult thing that is happening on their personal front. One is tops down, the other is bottoms up. And the way I address the difficulty is completely different, and you could go deep into each one. And then another bluff that you could use for this, which I just came up with earlier in the week, is let's talk about what makes someone difficult. It could be that they lack the hard skills for this particular project. Or it could be that they're lacking motivation for this particular project. Or it could just be that they're really lacking the soft skills. So the hard skill would be maybe this project requires someone to be really good at APIs, but this person just does not have that skill set. Now, the way you address that is very different, right? You find them a new team that's a better fit for them. Or the person is difficult because of motivational problem, which is what we talked about earlier for personal reasons. Then you try to be friends with them, or you take things off their plate, etc. So that type of resolution is different if it's a motivational problem. But if the reason why they're being difficult is because maybe they have a bad attitude, or they're just losing drive, or they just don't take feedback well, etc. Then the way you address it is to escalate to their manager, right? So the bluff that you would use here before you go into the details, which is the vertical part of the T, is bottom line is, well, in my experience, I've seen two different types of difficult team members, and you talk about the different types. And then you go deep. And again, this tactic really helps you sound a lot more senior because it highlights the different types of flavors you've seen before you go deep. And that is what makes you stand out as a more senior candidate.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up because we actually didn't talk about the third part of this three-part framework yet, which is forming that emotional connection. And most people would spend some time before the interview clearing their mind or go on a walk, but there's actually a lot more that you could do before the interview to help you get ready to establish that connection. And the first thing I would say to that, I'm going to come back to Mike later, is your mindset going into an interview. And I would say most of us have the mindset of a taker's mentality when we're going into an interview setting. We're showing up to take, obviously, because it's a job interview. I am showing up to take something from you. I want this job offer. I want to advance to the next level. I have needs. Therefore, I'm showing up to take. But my invitation here is to actually flip that mindset such that you're actually just showing up to give versus take. This is a difference between just two opposite mindset. Taker's mindset versus giver's mindset. What does it mean to give? You're not expecting anything back in return. It's no longer this exchange that you're expecting. And when you're not expecting something back, in return, the chemistry of this conversation just changes completely. You're showing up to give. You're showing up to maybe make a new friend. You're just showing up to share your stories and share your perspective and share your experiences. When you're not expecting things in return, the stakes are low and you can really be yourself. That is a difference between a giver's mindset versus a taker's mindset. And the second thing that you could do is what I call a positive presence around you. And this is a lot more than showing up with a positive personality or positive, upbeat energy. What I mean here is predetermining that this discussion is going to go well, pre-deciding that I'm going to like you as a person. I'm just going to connect well with you from one human being to another human being. And the tactics that I'm talking about here actually has very little to do with doing. These are not actions that you take. It's a state of mind. It's a state of being. And if you're just talking about, again, the original fundamental framing for this entire workshop is I just want to have a good conversation from the get-go so that you'll want to have more conversations with me down the line. That's the goal of standing out in an interview. If you just think about that from a very human angle, what are we? We're human beings. We're not human doings, right? So there's a lot more to being a human than what we do, but also who we be, right? Human beings. We're human beings. We're not just a list of actions that we're taking. We're not human doings, but we're human beings. When we're just acting like a human being, we are whole. We're acting like a whole person versus someone who's just focusing on the tactics of proving that they are competent. When we are whole, we're automatically unique because there is no one else like you. You are unique just by being you. That is you being you, human being and not human doing. So that would be my last advice for you when you're thinking about prepping for your next interview is to really just add that human element to this conversation. At the end of the day, an interview is about having a good conversation such that you want to have more conversations down the line. So there you have it. That is the 3 parts to our 3-part framework to increase your charisma such that you could really showcase your leadership qualities to establish a great first impression. Leadership quality because we're PMs. PMs are leaders. And leadership is not just about how you lead, but also how you be. It's your leadership presence. And same thing with first impression. It's not just what you say, but also how you say it. When you put everything together and you implement some of the tools that I share with you today, you're more likely to really increase your charisma level in your next interview. So I know we're at time, but I'm happy to stay on and take more questions if that is allowed.
Yes, that is definitely allowed. And I have compiled a few for you, Nancy, throughout
Okay.
the session. So I've pulled them out. And for those of you that are listening, this stuff works. I met Nancy in October, and I feel like when you do BLUFF, it's so much easier to focus on your first sentence or two in an explanation than to, and then you know, not get stuck in that trough of the star and drone on. So I totally resonate with this. And I think the reason why I wanted to bring Nancy on is she's not a, yes, these are frameworks, but it's frameworks that are emotional frameworks. And I feel like that's something that a lot of coaches kind of don't dive into. And it's that emotional side of interviewing, which is super critical at the moment. So there was 2 questions here about kind of transitioning. I'm going to try to do my best, but how do you connect the dots when you're transitioning from another industry into product management?
Well, then my question is, do you understand what product management is? When you're making that transition, there is discomfort from the hiring manager's perspective because they don't know if you could do the job or not. And it starts with what have you done in the past that makes you feel like you could be a good product manager? So I would first highlight the transferable skills, and it lowers their guard. When their guards are low, it checks the basic check boxes. Then you could talk about everything else. But the first thing you have to do is to lower that guard. And the guard is, well, can you be a PM? Can you be a PM? You've never been a PM before.
All right, I'll go to the next one and then I'll pass it to Duncan, the president of Product BC. But the next one was around we and I in interviews, and they had used we a lot, but they're wondering, how do you balance between that we and I?
Well, the question here is, how do you attribute credit for the work that you have done? And this goes back to, do you understand what the product manager does versus what the team does? If you're able to articulate what a product manager does, then it would feel a lot more natural when you're telling your stories. I did this versus we did this. So, for example, a product manager does not ship products. So when we're shipping, we say we shipped. We don't say I shipped, because product manager does not ship. So the question here is, what is your understanding of what a product manager does? And that is where you use I versus we.
All right, Duncan, do you wanna pop in with a question? And then I see Kay also has her hand up.
I talk enough. Let's make sure that Kay gets in before anyone else.
Oh, thank you. Nancy, I've been a huge fan of your methodology and teachings. I literally listened to, like, I think you have a video talking about like what you said at the last portion about building a connection. I literally listen to it like every time before I go into a call.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
But I did it today. It's become like a pre-interview ritual for me. I did it today though, and I just still struggled to really form a connection with that person. And I was wondering what your advice would be in this kind of case.
Yeah, my take on that is, as human beings, we vibrate on a spectrum. Each human being has their own frequency level, and frequency is a range. And when we don't resonate with someone, when we don't connect well with someone, it's very possible that we're just on two different frequency ranges.
Mm.
And that's completely okay. And in fact, I don't want to force myself to resonate with someone who's just completely off on a different spectrum.
Mm.
So if that's the case, then completely okay. I can only resonate with people in the same spectrum or same frequency range as me.
I see. So it's out of my hands in a way with certain people.
Well, it's not necessarily out of my hands as the position. The positioning here is, why does it bother you so much that you don't vibrate across the entire spectrum? We're not designed that way. So it's okay. And you're not missing out.
Mm.
That's my mindset, at least.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, we'll go with Eric. We are over time, so I'll be respectful of Nancy's time and go with one last question. So we'll go to Erica. So Erica, if you can come off mute.
Hi, Eric.
So I completely can relate to the mindset, because I think it's really shifted how I've been preparing for interviews. One thing I've struggled with is I kind of dive deep right away and I can't kind of zoom out. And I've sort of been training myself to first like look at the question and define it. Do you feel like that's a good practice with regard to any question that you're given, whether it's improve this product, how can you grow YouTube's revenue 2x, and just kind of look at like, okay, first go back, define the mission of the company, the product, the question around conflict. Is that kind of a good approach to think about?
Yes,
across the
always.
board?
And it also buys you more time.
Okay.
As in, what is conflict? Let's get philosophical for a second. What makes people difficult? Let's start the conversation at that level. And that is actually the difference between a more junior candidate and a more senior candidate.
Okay, perfect. I was watching the behavioral mock video earlier where you define conflict. And when you have the difficult situation, my mind immediately went like, let's define difficulty because it means something to you and that it might mean differently to me. So,
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
that's helpful. Thank you, Nancy.
I'm going to tag
All
on
right,
one.
well,
I'm going to tag
yeah.
on one quick note because I want to share this with the community because it's been extremely helpful for me. And I'm not going to joke this time. Going into any of the interviews, research the hell out of who you are talking with. The better you understand the person on the other side of the call before you get into it with them, the better the conversation can be. I've brought up interview quotes from people, and it makes them incredibly awkward, and it breaks down the walls immediately because they know that you are taking this seriously, that you respect their time, and it deepens the conversation. It cuts through so much of the preamble, and it gets really to the heart of things. So when it comes to building connection, show that you've done the legwork, which gives them confidence that you will do the legwork to connect with customers down the road. So that's my 2 cents on this.
I love that, Duncan. Also, I forgot to ask Mike. Mike, you spend 40% of your time on connection.
Except this connection. Mike had to jump out a little bit earlier.
Oh, okay. Maybe you
So
can send that as a follow-up.
I'm very certain Mike will make it to the next one too, Nancy. So yeah, if you didn't see in the chat there, we have May 7th at 5 p.m. for the next session on storytelling with Nancy. As some of the people commented as we wrap up, Nancy does have a YouTube channel. So if you loved what you saw here today, she has a lot of content on there. And we will be getting this out to everyone in kind of this event and the Product VC membership. If you've never heard of Product VC before today, we're British Columbia's largest product organization, and we are looking to put on more workshops like this where we bring in amazing speakers to help our members grow their product careers. So with that said, I'll leave the closing words to you, Nancy.
Thank you so much for having me, Ryan, and Product BC. This is what I love doing, to be able to just share my perspective with anyone who's willing to listen. And my perspective is most likely a different perspective from most, also because I kind of operate on a slightly different frequency. So thank you for having me, and thank you for listening. Find me on LinkedIn, and happy to answer any questions.